My baby dolls, we are back again, another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today we're talking a little bit more about old-time baseball. In fact, we're talking about Pud Galvin, baseball's first 300-game winner. And if you don't know who Pud Galvin is or why he is never really mentioned and why he slipped through the cracks, you're going to find out why, because we got author Brian Chip Martin on the show, and we'll get to both the book and Brian in just a second. But you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. We have a slew of shows coming up for you. We got Oakland A's baseball with Charlie O's niece, Nancy Finley. We got Peter Golenbach and crew with the Golenbach University. We got Mark Littell and Mark Whites in the wonderful Mark and Mark in the midday. We got Giants baseball. We got New York baseball. We got Philadelphia baseball with Bill Kashadis, and we have Chicago baseball with the one and only Eldon Ham, who has been not only being a sports lawyer for the last 40 years, but having his own radio show and following the heartbeat of Chicago sports for many years. And I'm just ecstatic being associated with the network. I was on a show for a while with famous author Dave Nemec and Alan Blumkin. We did Dave Nemec's old-time baseball and trivia, but Dave's been a little under the weather. I know Alan is doing Pittsburgh baseball with David Finoli, who has written many good books on the Pittsburgh area. And, of course, Pud Galvin, who we'll talk about soon, also was in the Pittsburgh area. In fact, I believe he died in the Pittsburgh area in Allegheny, a very poor man, was very young at 45. These guys lived very hard lives, and it's very interesting. But we do have Chip Martin on the show today, and Chip is an award-winning journalist. He lives in all places of London and Ontario, and I had a guy who went to law school with me. He moved to London, Ontario, which he's still up there. He sells real estate in the area. Interesting place up there in Canada. He is a member of the selection committee of the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame and the Society for American Baseball Research. All the big shots. They got all these titles. Me, I'm just a little guy. Without any further ado, welcome to the show, Chip.
Thank you, Ian. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, I'm glad to have you. Pud Galvin. There's no recorded histories like there are in more modern stuff. How the heck did you do all this research? How long did it take you to put this book together? And why Pud Galvin to begin with?
Well, it all makes sense. It's sort of like a chain. It all goes together. I wrote a book about our London Tecumsehs from London, Ontario, who were one of the top baseball teams back in the 1870s. And, in fact, they built a baseball park for them in 1877 that still exists here in London, Ontario, and it's considered the world's oldest baseball grounds because baseball is still played there to this day. One of the teams they played against was the Pittsburgh Alleghenies. They were known as the Alleghenies before they became the Pirates. And a star pitcher for them in 1877 when London won the International Association was Pud Galvin. And Pud was a very interesting character. And after the 1877 season, he moved to Buffalo for 1878 and would play against London again, played in London and in Buffalo. And in 1879, Buffalo became part of the National League. And in 1885, he was traded to Pittsburgh. And basically, I thought he was a very interesting character because nothing had ever been really written much about him. And he was the first baseball player to reach 300 wins at a time when pitchers pitched every day, sometimes in both ends of a doubleheader, and people just took no notice when he reached his 300th win. He ultimately became the fifth winningest pitcher of all time, and yet so very little was known about him. He died very early, and I tracked down his gravestone in Pittsburgh, and it was just a broken little piece of stone. And he died a pauper, and people forgot about him. And it wasn't until about 60 years after he died, a researcher in Buffalo took up his cause, and the Veterans Committee of the Hall of Fame inducted him into the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. I just thought he deserved to have his story told for a variety of reasons. But how I first learned about him was through the connection of him playing here in London against our local team, the Tecumsehs. It took about a year and a half, more or less, to write the book. and it's been out for about a year, and had some pretty good reception to it, and thanks for your interest in it, Ian.
Well, I like Pud Galvin. The guy is only, 5'9", and he weighed, he was overweight, I believe.
He was 5'8", and he got up to almost 300 pounds.
Yeah, so this guy's a small guy with a big gut, and and wait a minute, even before I start my inquiry on Pud Galvin, this guy pitched a perfect game after pitching an earlier game,
A no-hitter, yeah. He was in a tournament in Michigan in 1876 on the same day. He pitched a no-hitter, and then within 3 hours he pitched a perfect game against the Cass Club of Detroit, which was pretty well the top team of Detroit at the time. And so he therefore is the first professional pitcher to ever pitch a perfect game. In Major League, two pitchers, Richmond and John Montgomery Ward, pitched perfect games in 1880. But in terms of the first professional, Pud was the guy.
And he certainly was. Now let me just ask you this, because history is my thing. I got my master's in history. Basically, what I do is baseball history. I mean, I'm into all kinds of history, Canadian history, where you were up, all the good Mounties and the French Indian Wars and the War.
And the War of 1812 that Canada won, of course.
Yeah, well, Canada did. They staved off. And that's one of the reasons why when Quebec City still walled up after all these years, because they're still thinking that they're going to be invaded, which they were, and the Americans.
They were. It was actually a stalemate, but we had a little fun with you guys back when we didn't get along too well.
That's right, and the British marched in. But this is what I want to say about Pud Galvin. Was it true that his parents came over during the Great Irish Immigration during the potato famine?
During the potato famine, and they settled in an area called the Kerry Patch of St. Louis. And like many places on this side of the Atlantic, where the Irish tended to settle, they named the places after places in Ireland that they came from. So Kerry in Ireland was where Galvin's parents came from, and they settled in the Kerry Patch in St. Louis. And yes, they escaped the potato famine, and it was a pretty large area of Irish, poor Irish, in St. Louis, and it was a pretty hard-scrabble, rough area. And Pud, for some reason, was able to. He was just a little guy. He stayed out of trouble and fell in love with baseball and made a career of it, and avoided all the troubles that a lot of his contemporaries got into.
Now, I have David Fleitz. I don't know if you've ever read books by David Fleitz, but he wrote a book, The Irish in Baseball. And for some reason, baseball attracted immigrants, even though it was, a very rough sport. Now, let me ask you this question.
Lots of Irish in baseball, and Germans, too.
The Germans and the Irish, they all migrated to baseball. Let me ask you this question. His real name is James Francis Galvin.
Yep.
I know the reason why they named him Pud. But I'd love you to give me the answer why they call him Pud Galvin.
Well, they actually called him several things. He was only called Pud in print while he was alive on a couple of occasions. Most of the time he was known as Gentle James or Old James or Jeems or the little steam engine, because he was so fat that when he ran around the bases he'd huff and puff like a little steam engine. But the origins of his name Pud is that he was reputed. He had a pretty darn good fastball, even though he was just a little guy with small hands. He didn't have a particularly good curve, but he had a really wicked fastball and a great pickoff move. And he could turn batters into pudding. So they gave him the name Pud. Well, maybe it should be Pud. And I met a bunch of members of the Galvin family back in September when we had a ceremony at his gravesite to give him a proper headstone that was donated by Major League Baseball and the Society for American Baseball Research and others who gave money. And members of his family told me that the name Puddin or Pud was a name in the family, like it was an affectionate name. So maybe it should be pronounced Pud Galvin, but we of course have no oral accounts of his time, or we can't interview him obviously. So I've been calling him Pud Galvin. Maybe it should be Pud Galvin because of pudding.
Yeah, well, you know what? His body looked like pudding, but that was, his body looked like pudding, but that guy could sure. And not only that, what really fascinated me most about reading your book was the pickoff move he had in an era when that wasn't really used. This guy was a master of it.
He was, and Cap Anson over in Chicago, he used to complain bitterly about it, said it was illegal and all that sort of thing, but Pud had an ability to get that ball over to first base when the batters were snoozing, or the runners were snoozing, and it was a very effective move and very much a part of his arsenal. As I say, he didn't have much of a curveball. He had they called it a cannonball curve because it didn't have a lot of break to it. He had fairly small hands, so his grip wasn't great. But the fastball and the pickoff move, those are the things that made him famous.
Now let me just read you a couple of stats here, and then I'm going to ask you a question. 6,003 innings pitched, 646 complete games. You're not even going to find a pitcher these days that's going to do 20 complete games. Although Verlander did it the other day against my Yankees.
Very unusual.
You know, both of which are second only to Cy Young. And I think, quoting you, he was Cy Young before Cy Young. Upon his retirement, Galvin held the all-time records in pitching categories, including wins, innings pitched, games started, games completed, and shutouts. He became, like I mentioned in the beginning of the show, the first 300-game winner in 1888. He holds the record for most games started in a single season by a pitcher before 1893, which was 75 because they only had a two-man rotation back then. And Galvin is the only player in baseball in history to win 20 or more games in 10 different years without winning a pennant, and finished his career with a total of 365 wins, which is still fifth, I believe, and 310 losses. Why was he lost to history with all those stats?
I don't know. And in the course of his record, there were two back-to-back 46-win seasons in Buffalo. 83 and 84, I think, were the years. So his numbers were phenomenal. Here's what I think, the reason that he was forgotten to history. Until 1884, pitchers could not pitch overhand. It was underhand delivery. So the underhand delivery, and any softball coach will tell you, is easier on the arm for a long amount of pitching than throwing overhand. It's more natural. Your arm doesn't get as tired. You don't pull as many muscles and that sort of thing. So he was aided by the fact that the underhand pitching was the order of the day until 1884. That's part of his longevity. He also, as far as being forgotten, he died in 1902, just at the beginning of a new century. He was considered sort of, and he never did pitch from 60 foot 6 inches. He retired in 1892. It wasn't until 1894 that 60 foot 6 inches came in. I think the longest he pitched from was something like 57 feet. So he had a shorter pitching distance. He had part of his career underhand pitching. So I think that when the new century dawned and they had new stars like Christy Mathewson and Hannes Wagner and Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker and Babe Ruth, the focus was on the new century, and the old guys from the previous century were sort of forgotten. Well, that wasn't really the same game we're playing today. They didn't pitch from as far, they were different rules, that sort of thing. So I think he was considered sort of part of the dustbin of baseball history for a long time. And the new century came and the new stars, and the focus became Babe Ruth especially. And I think the old-timers were sort of forgotten. And it wasn't until this researcher in Buffalo, a guy named Joe Overfield, started looking into it. He was a statistician, historian for the Buffalo Bisons, and Pud pitched for them, of course, back from 1878 to 1885. And Joe did some great research and uncovered the game reports and the numbers that Pud had accomplished and put them together in a comprehensive and compelling way and persuaded the Hall of Fame that he'd been forgotten and that he should be remembered. And that's when he got in the Hall of Fame. And ironically and perhaps symbolically, his headstone had been forgotten. It was just a tiny little broken thing in two places. It just said J.F. Galvin. And this was for the first professional pitcher to pitch a perfect game, the fifth winningest pitcher of all time, the first to reach 300 wins. He was forgotten by history, and that's why one of the motivations I had in writing my book, I thought he should be remembered, and now they've got a fine new headstone at his grave in Calvary Cemetery in Pittsburgh that remarks on his wonderful history and notes his accomplishments and the fact he's a Hall of Famer. So, sorry that's a long-winded answer, but that's my take.
Now let me ask you this: Where did Pud get his start? Which league did he get his start in?
Well, he started pitching as a professional in St. Louis in 1875. He pitched they had two teams there. They had the Browns and they had the Reds, the Brown Stockings and the Red Stockings. And the Brown Stockings was a bit better team, and it had outside players from beyond St. Louis. The Reds was not quite as good a team, and it was more local players. The Browns, he played for them in 1876, and he recorded 4 wins for them. 1875, 4 wins for them in the old National Association. So those are credited to his record. 1876, he pitched for the Reds, and they were not affiliated, and they went all over the place and played in tournaments. And it was during one of those tournaments in Michigan that he pitched the perfect game after the no-hitter. In 1877, he was signed by Pittsburgh, the Alleghenies. That was Pittsburgh, like London and Guelph up here, and Syracuse and Rochester, and a number of other cities, Columbus, Ohio, were charter members of the International Association. And that was a rival league set up to challenge the National League, which had been established in 1876. The National League was sort of exclusive and only had 6 teams or so. And the International Association was a larger organization, and it had teams on both sides of the border, 2 of them from up here in Canada. And it was intended to be a rival for the National League, and attracted some terrific ball players. Fred Goldsmith, one of the first curveball pitchers, Galvin, a number of other players, Joe Horning, Dutch Horning, who went on to quite a career, and a number of very, very good players that were attracted to the International Association. After moving to Buffalo, which became a member of the International Association in 1878, Buffalo then became a member of the National League, and Pud stayed with them until 1885, and then back to Pittsburgh until 1892. And at the very tail end of his career, he was sold to St. Louis and only pitched a few games there before hanging them up.
Now, this is what I want to say about Pud. This International League and stuff like that, this International Association, he should have 50 more wins accredited to his name. Now, let me just say something before you give the answer. This is where he had his other 2 showings. In 1880, in the 1880s, he had that. But look what we have here. We have major cities in this league that, a lot of them, what was his name, who started the Players League, Montgomery Ward.
Yeah, John Montgomery Ward, yeah.
They were all in this league, and yet the National Major League Baseball doesn't recognize his records. Why is this?
Well, the International Association existed for 4 years, 1877 to 1880 inclusive. And in the first 2 years especially, it was a very strong rival. And when teams from the International Association played the National League, it was about 50-50. No league was particularly superior to the other in terms of the personnel. The International Association, and John Thorne, the Major League Baseball historian, has said this repeatedly, the International Association did not consider itself subordinate in any way to the National League. It was a competitive rival. And on the field, the product was very similar. The last year of the International Association, when there were no longer any Canadian teams in it, was called the National Association, and it was rather weak, and it only had 3 teams in it. But for the first couple, maybe 3 years of its existence, it was a rival, viable league, attracting some of the best baseball players. However, Major League Baseball historians and Major League Baseball itself have decreed which leagues are considered major and which ones are not. They have decided that the International Association was not. And the argument they use is that it was too unstable, that teams would come and go, and that some of the record-keeping wasn't all that great. Well, the same arguments can be used against the National Association of 1871 to 1875, but records from players in that league are included in their official totals in their career. Other leagues, like the Union Association of 1884, records from that are considered. From the Federal League of 1914, 1915 are considered, and also from the Players League of 1890, as well as the American Association of 1882 to 18. Help me here, 18. I can't remember the exact years. Yeah, 91.
Yeah, it was 1 year, 1898.
Yeah. 91. So there's for some reason, the Major League Baseball and the historians have decided that the International Association doesn't cut it, and therefore the records of some of these great players like Pud Galvin don't count either. And it's a darn shame, because Pud would move from the 5th winningest pitcher of all time to the 3rd winningest pitcher of all time if the wins he had in the International Association were counted. There were 36 of those wins. He doesn't get any credit for them.
Let me ask you this. We know the Western League became the American League, and then you had that great baseball war of 1900 and 1902. But let me ask you this. When Van Johnson was getting tossed to the wind and they were ready to bring in Landis, what people don't know is that the American League wanted to move over to the National League and expand to 12 teams in the National League because they had lost all faith in Van Johnson. My question is, there was always teams changing. Why would they look down and frown upon such a league when you have Mike King Kelly and all these great guys that are in the Hall of Fame?
Well, the additional problem you'd have with the International Association was some of the cities that it operated in were smaller. Places like Ithaca, New York, Hornellsville, New York. Some of those places were rather small. There were some large cities too, but it was also in the early days of baseball. So the record keeping wasn't. I mean, they were still learning how to keep records back then, and it differed from larger community to smaller community. So Joe Overfield in Buffalo demonstrated that you can actually go, and if you do some time and do some research, you can actually dig up the old box scores and the game accounts, and you can figure out who did what the stats were. The central record keeping and the central scheduling that characterizes more recent leagues was not there at the time. So it's a little harder to do, but I think in fairness to the players that played back then, it should be done. And perhaps somebody with a more a mind that's better at numbers than myself. I'm the history and the words kind of guy, but somebody who can go down and actually compile and pull this stuff together. I mean, the Society for American Baseball Research is full of people who like sabermetrics and are in love with numbers and accounting and all those sorts of things. And I would have thought that somebody from there would say, listen, it's about time the International Association received its due. Another thing, and I just toss it out there, it may be sort of dismissed by Major League Baseball historians because it's called the International Association. And for the longest time, there's been a certain chauvinism about baseball and America. And, of course, having to prove that it was born in Cooperstown led to all sorts of problems with that durable myth. And it may be that it's just considered because it's international, it's not really our game as much. So even though there are only 2 Canadian teams in the International Association, I'm just throwing it out there. I'm not saying it's a factor, but who knows? There may be some slight element of that in the decision making.
Well, you know what? You came to the right guy. So this is what I want you to do after the show, Brian. This is what I want you to call up Saber. Say you were on my show. Ian's a tax attorney. He knows accountant. Why don't you pay him to go out there and collect the data? We'll get these guys. This is how it is,
Hey, one hand washes the other, Ian. That sounds great.
This is how it is when we get the international. But something you mentioned Canada. And so now
I'll look after the stuff in Canada for that. The Guelph and London teams. You can do the American side of that, and we'll work together.
Well, I'll tell you this, Chip. This is because the league was, I think, in Manchester, New Hampshire.
Yep.
Lynn, Massachusetts. So I'm
Lowell, Mass, too, I think.
Yeah, Lowell, Lynn. I mean, there was
Manchester?
Manchester, New Hampshire. There was a few teams around here. I know that they were in London, they were in Guelph, Ontario, they were in Pittsburgh, they were in Rochester.
Columbus?
Yep, Columbus. So there's a few places. All you need to do is get the list of towns, and I just go get the box scores, and then we'll all compile the records and get these guys in.
Yeah. No, there's and we talked about Pud and getting his 300 games and how he could be the 3rd winningest pitcher of all time if he was given credit for the International Association. Well, there's a really I'm just going to pull it out here. There's a really interesting character who, I don't know if I have it right here or not. One of the pitchers in the International who put time in the International Association. He won 8 games there, and his official record of games pitched is 294. Had he been given credit for the 8 wins in the International Association, he could be a member of the exclusive 300 wins club. So he's even more hard done by than Pud is.
Well, you know something, Pud would be he would have, 401 wins at the end?
401, yep.
Right, so right, and behind who? Cy Young and Walter Johnson.
Yeah, pretty good company.
You know, it's funny because I speak to Walter Johnson's grandson who wrote the definitive biography on John Johnson, and he loves that era. He edited the tapes for Lawrence Ritter's The Glory of Their Times.
Oh, that's a wonderful book. I think that's the best baseball book ever.
Yeah, well, you know what, Ritter, I was telling you the other day that Smokey Joe Wood, he got in touch with Ritter, and he did some tapes that were never published, and they're at Notre Dame Library. You go listen to it, and he tells the story of early baseball. And you know what? He also tells the story of players like Cy Young and stuff who came from the 1890s and who continued dominance in the early 20th century. Honus Wagner was another one, King Kelly, Cap Anson. In Chicago, again, he left a legacy, which the Cubs would become a huge dynasty in the early odd numbers. But let me ask you about Pud here. You know something? Not only is he this great pitcher, he pitched every other day, he's also the godfather of juicing here. What's going on with that?
Oh, my. Well, that's the other aspect of Pud that is interesting and sort of tweaked my interest. You may recall, Ian, about 10 years ago, more or less, maybe 12, getting on to 12 now, there was that great controversy in baseball about the, Canseco and Palmeiro and Sosa and McGuire and all these guys who were juicing in baseball, taking performance-enhancing drugs, and how, the balls were flying out of the park and these guys were bulking up and something was amiss. And you recall that Sports Illustrated guy, I think it was, that spotted the androstenedione in Mark McGuire's locker, and started asking some questions. And this is baseball. This is testosterone-based stuff that these players were using to enhance their performance. And you may recall McGuire and Sosa and their home run battle. And the problem was that their activities were seen as being tainted by having taken artificial stimulants, artificial means to boost what was already pretty good performance, but to just take it to another level. And the controversy arose back then that, should they be allowed to get into the Hall of Fame? I mean, they cheated. Well, it's interesting to note, and I note in my book, that cheating has been a part of baseball since day one. Rogers Hornsby, the great player, once said he'd never been in a baseball game that somebody hadn't cheated somehow or other. I mean, we've seen spitballs, we've seen sandpaper, we've seen stealing of signs, we've seen, stealing of bases is a legal thing, and it's part of baseball. All sorts of things go on in baseball that people are trying to get an edge. And so when people were saying, the baseball writers were saying, well, these guys that took performance-enhancing drugs, testosterone and the like, they should not be admitted into the Baseball Hall of Fame because they cheated. Their performances weren't natural, and therefore they shouldn't be in there. Well, some other people started saying, well, there's cheating's been part of baseball for a long time. A lot of people who were in the Baseball Hall of Fame were cheated or were really miserable people like Ty Cobb, who used to always come in with the spikes high and always was trying to look for an extra edge. And then somebody, a lawyer named Abrams, wrote a book about cheating in baseball and some of the things that have gone on, and he drew attention to the fact that Pud Galvin is in the Baseball Hall of Fame, was put in there in 1965, and that he had taken testosterone back in 1889 and to enhance his performance, and then had gone out and played a lot better. He was on the tail end of his career, and he went out, and the very next day he played the game of his life. The New York Times accounts of the time said he played the best game of his life. The Washington Post said, yes, he took this elixir of life, which was a testosterone-based formula from dogs and guinea pigs, the testes of dogs and guinea pigs. And he went out and he played really well. And the Washington Post said, this is great for baseball. If all baseball players would take it, the game would be thus elevated, and this would particularly be helpful to provincial teams. So it was something going on back then. It was called the Elixir of Life, and it was developed by a medical doctor, and he wrote about it in the Lancet, which was the British medical journal, and he said it was a wonderful thing that it did. He injected it into himself, that even though he was an older man, he could bound up stairs now like he hadn't been able to do since he was a young man. He was able to stand at his workbench for hours. He didn't need to have a nap after dinner anymore. I mean, he even said he's no longer constipated, and his urine jet is stronger than it had been for years. So he raved about this, and this was called the Elixir of Life. And this is back in the days of, traveling salesmen and potents and liniments and all that sort of stuff. But this guy was a legitimate medical doctor. Well, 12,000 doses of this were administered across the United States in 1888 to 1889. One of the doses was administered by the Pittsburgh Medical College by injection into the thigh of Pud Galvin before a game, and he went out and played terrifically well. Not only did he pitch well, but he also got several hits. And they raved about this and saying anyone who doubts the value of this elixir, they just need to look at the performance of Pud Galvin yesterday. And the papers were all full of it. And there were testimonials about this elixir of life, what a great thing it is. And it was around for about maybe 2 years. It was sort of like the hula hoop of medicine. And then it faded out. And Pud played, we only have evidence of him injecting once. And he played really well for a couple of weeks, and then we didn't hear about it again. So people who were saying that Sosa, McGuire, Palmeiro, and the like should be in the Hall of Fame said, well, look, if you're talking about cheating with performance-enhancing drugs, there's somebody already in the Hall of Fame who did that, and that's Pud Galvin. Well, the postscript of this whole story, Ian, at the risk of going on too long, is back in 2002, some researchers in Australia, medical researchers in Australia, they got the recipe from the Brown-Séquard formula for the elixir of life, the same thing that was injected into Pud Galvin, and they analyzed it under modern-day standards, and they discovered that there was nothing of any biological value in that extract that he took. It was all in his mind. He thought he was going to play better, so he did. There was no chemical influence that would impact him biologically.
And you know something, you mentioned the traveling salespeople the other day, and of course, you see it spoofed in all the old cartoons, And,
oh, yeah.
You see it spoofed. But basically, what those miracle formulas were basically alcohol-based.
And cocaine and all that sort of stuff, sure.
I mean, Coca-Cola was made from the coca leaf until, I think, 1906. For 20 years, people were getting high. Off of Coca-Cola. This was no different. But let me just say this. But this tells a story two different ways. One is that if you put your mind to something, even if you think you're sluggish, even if you think you can't do it, and you take a special formula and it really doesn't work, it's because you mentioned your mind is telling you to win, and so you're winning. You're believing, in yourself, maybe a little dubious, overshadowed by this elixir over here. But the other side of it is no one can ever say that Pud juice, because that was totally worthless, as was given in 2002. But in general, the guys that juiced, it could go either side of the coins.
I know. You and I have discussed this, and I am of the view that, I think I side with the majority, although that may change in years to come. I don't believe that people who juiced should be in the Hall of Fame. Tony La Russa, the great coach, of course, says, they should be there, but they should have an asterisk after their name. And other people have said, well, there should be a special juiced wing at the Hall of Fame for them. And yet others say, no, they cheated, and they knowingly cheated to get an edge, and that their record is tainted. And I know there are others, including people like yourself that have legal background and training, would love to take this thing to court and say, listen, these people should be there because they're no different in many ways than the people who are already in the Hall of Fame.
And it's true, because I'll tell you why. Even if you take the stuff, you got to go back in time and say, well, this stuff wasn't not allowed by the Major League Baseball. This stuff wasn't prohibited. There's 5,000 steroids out there. What are you going to do, pick and choose which ones are going to be allowed and which ones are, because there are certain steroids that are allowed in baseball, but they just
and even painkillers,
right.
Ian. I was heard an interview with a major league manager recently talking about the painkillers are prevalent out there, and if you're killing the pain in order to play, that's trying to get an edge as well, isn't it?
It certainly is, because you're taking away. You're enhancing your performance by taking the pain away, just like you're enhancing performance by building muscle and building strength and building velocity on your ball or your legs or whatever it is. It's no different than saying the bicyclist. Look at Lance Armstrong. He doped for years.
Yep. No. It's a great discussion, and there's a great gray area there in the whole debate. I mean, I love Rogers Hornsby saying that he never played in a game of baseball that somebody wasn't cheating, and you have that institutionalized thing of stealing a base. Well, that's a good thing, I mean, the legal and the moral aspects of the game of baseball are fascinating and make for great conversation, make for great arguments, and hopefully make for great podcasts.
And they do, and I mean, baseball is so, and I love discussing this with you because it goes back to a period of time here when not a lot of people understand. People were dirt poor. There was a recession in 1893 that pretty much wiped out most players, including Pud. His life savings, not only overspent, but people don't know about the potato famine. They don't know about post-war Civil War baseball. They don't know about stuff. In your case here, Pud's records started to surface around 1878 because there wasn't any records to show any other difference. But this is what I want to say about baseball. It's an evolving history. In 1967, people stopped going to baseball games because it was the period of the pitchers era. Bob Gibson and Denny McLean and all these other guys, Sandy Koufax, ERAs fell, and now they wanted to do something to bring people back in the park, so they got the designated hitter, okay? Chicks dig the home runs. They dig scoring. Now, 30 years later, you're breaking all kinds of records, and all these guys on TV, these statisticians say, well, McGuire's hitting 1 out of every 7 ball out of the park. That's kind of like not normal, what I mean? So it's an evolution, but with this evolution, if you were able to use performance-enhancing drugs, and it goes back to the 1940s and 50s with red juice and greenies to keep you up all night and traveling and all this stuff, then they should be excluded because it was performance-enhancing drugs, keeping you awake. Now, Mickey Mantle is something of an enigma. He just drank himself. He don't even remember half his at-bats.
One would have thought that was a performance-depressing situation. Yeah.
I mean, when they
and look, Babe Ruth. I mean, same thing. All the alcohol and womanizing and partying, and yet he still managed to knock that ball out of the park at a record pace. So, who knows?
But on a legal standpoint for Ruth, I don't know if the kind of alcohol served in the 1920s was performance-enhancing because of his numbers, but it was definitely illegal because it was prohibition in the United States, and yet he broke the laws, and people went to jail if they broke the laws, if they were caught in speakeasies and stuff. This guy's in the Hall of Fame. He was a drinker. He was a womanizer. He is the bar that baseball is modeled after. If you want to be a star, you got to be like the Babe. And everyone who came after Babe Ruth is just in his shadow. And you know something? That's how big of life he was. Now, even before Babe, Pud Galvin, he was bigger than life. People loved this guy.
Oh yeah, they just loved him. When he died at age 45, he was broke as could be. His buddies had put together a benefit to raise money for his family. He had 6 kids, and he's living in rental quarters in sort of a slummy area of Pittsburgh. And he died, and he had a funeral in this Catholic church on the north side, which was Allegheny City. It's now called the north side of Pittsburgh. It's north side of the Allegheny River. And he was buried 8 miles away. And he had all sorts of people that walked alongside his casket to the cemetery, which was 8 miles away, and then you have to be a billy goat to get up into the top of the cemetery where he was actually buried. And people loved him so much, there were dozens upon dozens of people that did the walk and saw him to his final resting place. That's the love that they had for him in Pittsburgh. He was their star. Same thing in Buffalo. He was considered the first superstar, sports superstar in Buffalo, and he carried that over into Pittsburgh as well.
Because when Babe died in New York, I mean, everyone went by the casket to go see
him. Oh,
him.
yeah.
Just like Valentino when he died in the 1920s. For miles, the women, they were throwing themselves at the coffin. I mean, this was the sign. Pud Galvin, and I want people to understand this, he was a very humble man. He was a very easygoing man. He was very well liked. People loved when he pitched. The attendance records were, up that day. I mean, he had one or two pitches. He perfected this move that picked people off. His longevity is also accounted for because chances are in today's game, when you pitch 1 out of every 2 starts, you're probably going to have a career of 5 to 7 years. This guy pitched for 18 seasons, traveled all over the place from, Buffalo to Pittsburgh and everywhere in between, and yet he's forgotten.
Yep, he was, and hopefully we're trying to address that because he was really one of the first stars, one of the pioneering stars of the game, and to be able to say you were the first professional pitcher to pitch a perfect game, and then also the first to 300 wins, and they didn't take note of either of those accomplishments at the time while he was alive. He drew no acclaim for his spectacular numbers during his lifetime, and that's to me that's quite sad.
And you know something? I mean, if you're going to include records into Major League Baseball, you cannot say to me the Western League stats don't count, the International League don't count because you had Canadian teams. Well, you know what? You had Montreal for 36 years here, and you have Toronto now for about 31 years. So if you're going to use Canada as an excuse not to get the records in, well, I can tell you right now, Major League Baseball expanded because they saw a market in both places back then.
And who knows? They may go back to Montreal for all we know. And I should point out, for the benefit of your listeners, Ian, that we've played baseball here just about as long as you guys have played on your side of the border. A lot of people that were playing baseball, either the Massachusetts game or the New York game, in their home parts of the States, a lot of those people, they moved up to Canada to get cheaper land or because they wanted to remain loyal to the Crown or they were on their way farther west and they stopped on the way and said, hey, I can get free land here. I think I'll make settle. And so we have the first recorded game of baseball ever is in 1838, and it's about 40 miles from where I'm sitting right now in a place called Beachville, Ontario. And the fellow that told the story, that wrote about that first game in 1838 in Sporting Life a number of years later, I believe that his story was taken and borrowed and modified by the fellow, Abner Graves, that told the story about Cooperstown of 1839. So we go back. I'm not saying that the first game ever was played here. The point is that games were played in the early 1800s and perhaps even earlier on both sides of the border. So sometimes people say, yeah, it's the Americans' national pastime, but we've been playing it here just about as long as you guys have as well. So, and we considered, little towns in Ontario. Everybody thinks Canada is all about hockey, but you can go around this part of Ontario where I'm from, and you can go through these farm communities and smaller centers. They may not have enough money to have an arena, a shinny palace for hockey, Canada's game, but they sure as heck all have baseball diamonds. So it's a tradition that goes a long way back. So to suggest that somehow baseball is less baseball, if you say international in the name of the organization, I think that's a bit of a mistake.
Yeah, exactly. And now let me ask you this about Pud Galvin. A heavy guy, all the stuff. Now I think Charlie Foley, who was a teammate of Galvin, mentioned that when he was being shipped out from San Francisco, he took a train a certain way, then walked 23 minutes, and then went through the desert and he burnt the ship. What the hell's up with that?
Well, he wasn't very happy with what he was being offered in Buffalo, as I recall, in terms of a contract. So it was around 1880, 81, somewhere in there. And he went out with Foley and a couple of other guys, and they went out and played in San Francisco. Their season started a lot earlier out there in the year, and he was out there and he was pitching, and they expected him back in Buffalo. And I can't remember all the details of it, but the bottom line is that they were threatening him with legal action and all that sort of thing. So he said, all right, I guess I'll have to go back. But they wouldn't let him out of his contract in San Francisco. So he took a train. Apparently Pinkerton detectives were on his tail by the management of the team out there that wanted to make sure he hung around. So I guess to give them the slip, he took a train to near the border of California and Arizona or something, and then had to walk in the desert for a length of time in order to elude the detectives, and before he got to another place where he could get a train, and apparently his shoes almost melted off or something, and it was a great length of a walk he made through the desert in order to escape the authorities. Well, he got away okay, and he wound up, I think it was Indianapolis or somewhere. He showed up for a game and just, for Buffalo and started pitching again. So, it was one of the many little interesting episodes that Pud had.
Now, post-playing career, his career ended in 1892. His last three starts were very poor. I mean, he was overweight. He was out of shape. He was a little older. Well, probably a lot older. But now, the day after January 1st, 1894, you find him in Cleveland here, and he's being accused of stealing. What the hell's going on with this?
Yeah, that was, I read some conflicting accounts of that. I wasn't exactly clear. There was something about collecting a debt, and he fell in with some guys, and I can't remember, you've read it more recently than I have. I think it was a guy that ran a clothing store or something that was claiming that he got ripped off by Galvin and some cronies. Well, at the end of the day, I don't think much came of it. The guy didn't show up in court, as I recall, to testify against him. But I believe Pud and some of his buddies were held overnight in jail, if I recall. Is that right, Ian? You've read it more recently than I have.
Yeah, I'll tell you what it was about. They were in Cleveland. They were visiting a sick friend. Then they all went, and after they visited their friend, they went to a bar.
They hit a bar.
And
that's Pud.
Yep, and then they met a guy. His name was H.W. Hubbard. He was a tailor.
A tailor, yeah.
And he introduced them to the folks at the bar, which Pud was at. Now, after leaving Hubbard's company, because I guess they showed him around, the group was they were accused. They were arrested, really, for stealing $250 diamond pin and $125 gold watch from the tailor. Yeah. Now, this is what really they've thrown into a cell, which is like a stink hole in Mexico. They got miscreants and pestilent insects running all over them, and the judge dropped the charges because there was no evidence. So that's what.
I don't know. I mean, Pud was really well liked by his buddies, his cronies, and you may recall what was the name? Was it Palmer O'Neill? I think it was the manager or the owner of the Pittsburgh team was one of the places they were at, and he was sitting on the front porch enjoying a smoke in the evening, and the players were all tucked into their beds up above and getting ready for the game the next day, and he hears this rustling, and all of a sudden there's Pud and a bunch of his buddies from the team. They're clambering down the fire escape under cover of darkness, and they were all going to go out to do some drinking. And O'Neill says, "This is going to cost you," and $25 or whatever it was. And Pud says, "Oh, that's okay. We just have to go get something to drink." So he was always sort of the ringleader of one of the guys that was going out to party. And so this was all part of his makeup. He was a hail fellow, well met, and I'm sure there wasn't a beverage that he ever turned down. And there were lots of them offered to him over the course of his career.
Not only that, but in 1895 he became an umpire. How was his stint as an umpire?
I don't think it was very successful. After baseball, he found virtually no success at anything. He ran a bar with a partner. The partner absconded with some money. It was a pretty high-class bar in downtown Pittsburgh in a nice area. His partner ripped him off for money. He lost the bar. He would work for Ed Hanlon, one of his old teammates, and who kept an eye out for him and gave him accommodation at the end when he couldn't really afford much. And things just didn't work out. Post-baseball, people still loved him, and he'd be hanging around the bars. I suspect as long as he was running a bar, he was probably drinking away a good chunk of the profits himself, because people just liked him. He was just a likable Irish guy, probably a great talker, and he would have stories to tell about his career. And I know people just loved him in Buffalo and then later in Pittsburgh. He was, as I say, he was a hail fellow, well met, a typical Irish guy, just likable, and he liked his beverages.
Well, you know, it's funny because he did odd jobs like being a pipe layer and contractor. And, of course, he was a saloon owner in Pittsburgh. But the thing is, they said, some accounts say, he had the largest bar in Pittsburgh. He employed 9 bartenders at one point.
Yeah, it was a pretty high-class place he had there going for a while. He also, you may recall, he also oversaw the upgrading and expansion of Exposition Park in Pittsburgh at the request of ownership. They gave him the job to sort of oversee the fix-up of the park. So there was always people offering him jobs and giving him something to do. But I think he drank away most of his money. He had a big family, and he really had no money at the end. He was paid very, very well. I mean, 10 times the wage of an average working guy on his best years. And yet he never really put money away to look after himself or his family, and he died. He's in a pauper's grave, basically, and the headstone was something that was only paid for by, I think, as part of the proceeds from the benefit that was held for him and his family. It was planned for him while he was still alive, but he succumbed to a gastrointestinal ailment and died at age 45, and the benefit went ahead after his death, and the money went to his wife and children, the surviving children, and I think some of the funds may have gone to the very modest headstone.
Now, the joke on Pud was he had 11 kids, enough to fill a baseball diamond with 2 replacements as well, but something tragic happened. One of his kids fell into a hot vat in a factory. How the hell did that happen?
Well, yeah, he lived on what's called Allegheny City, which is now the north side of Pittsburgh. And he was, of course, away on the road a lot with baseball. And it was right around the time. It was very, very late in his career. And he had just been sold by Pittsburgh to St. Louis, Chris Vonderay in St. Louis, back to his hometown. He didn't really want to go. He sort of went under protest. It was 1892, and his career was just about done. And he had all his friends, his buddies, his cronies, and all that sort of thing, and his family, of course, all living in Pittsburgh, Allegheny City. And he was shipped out to St. Louis, and he just barely arrived in St. Louis, and he got a message from back home that his young son, Eugene, I think he was about age 8, was playing in Allegheny City, and there was a salt works that had a big vat that I guess they boiled salt or something. I'm not exactly sure. Some technology we no longer have. But apparently young Eugene had fallen, was playing near this thing and fell in and basically was cooked in boiling salted water and was in really bad shape. And Pud raced back from Pittsburgh in order to be there, and his son died. He had to attend the funeral. And he goes back to Pittsburgh, goes back to St. Louis as a very sad situation. And Chris Vonderay docks him pay for being away, for missing baseball games to attend to the funeral of his son, which didn't endear Pud to Vonderay all that much. The St. Louis owner, was a bit of a hard-nosed character anyway. And so it was sort of a sad thing, and within a matter of weeks, Pud's career was over. So it was a sort of a sad ending for him.
Yeah, I mean, that's when the book gets depressing. But you know something? I had a great time talking about Pud today. I hope you did also.
Oh, I always love talking about Pud. And, Ian, the fact you've read it and understand it, that to me is terrific. It's a wonderful story. I'm glad you were able to read it and that we're able to share it with your listeners out there, because the story of Pud Galvin is a really neat one. I enjoyed writing it, and I love talking about it.
What's coming up next for you for writing?
Well, my book about the Detroit Wolverines, which was the National League team in Detroit from 1881 to 1888, is going to be out shortly. It's my fourth baseball book, and that's with McFarland, and that should be just a couple of months away. I just signed my contract for my 8th book and my 5th one on a baseball topic, and it's about Brother Mathias, the Canadian-born brother who taught Babe Ruth how to play baseball.
And you know, some of your work is magnificent. The research you do is, as a lawyer, I can tell you, it's a gift you have, because, and your writing is clear style. I recommend everyone to go out and get Pud Galvin. The holidays are coming out. It would be a great Christmas gift for anyone who loves historical baseball, not only because, you know, you're learning something new about Pud Galvin, but you're learning about the whole time period. You're learning about classic baseball, where a lot of people don't really understand that people didn't play with gloves. People used to fight in the stands. People used to beat the hell out of the umpire if he made a bad call or something like this. This was a very, very difficult time period to play. And you've written a stellar book on Pud Galvin, Chip.
Thank you, Ian. I really appreciate that. And I try to also relate it to what's going on in the time in society, because baseball reflects its times in many ways. Jackie Robinson, for instance, and the battle about desegregation and those sorts of things more recently. But back then, the industrialization of America and the great strike, the great railway strike that gripped Pittsburgh, and I think 20-something people were murdered, and Galvin and his ball team had to play through it. So I try to relate baseball to its days and in the context of its time. And the funniest part of the Galvin book is the newspapers were saying, it'd be great if everybody took this testosterone testosterone concoction, because it'll make baseball so much better. My times have changed.
Yeah, now it's just like, 120 years later, we're all pointing fingers. Hold the line. I'm going to end the show. This is all my listeners know. I end the show. Folks, go out, get Pud Galvin, baseball's first 300-game winner. You'll learn something new. Thank you, Chip, for being on the show. For me, I'm your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and I'm tuning out. And for the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.